being here today. I'm excited to have this conversation, and we're just going to be talking about the importance of history to Christianity and to the Christian, and then also kind of the importance of confessionalism, if that falls into the same area. So the first question I have is, what do we mean when we say that Christianity is historical?
Well, I think we can go right to the Apostle Paul and his sermons in Acts, right? These things didn't happen in a corner.
Sure.
They happen in space and time, and we confess this, crucified under Pontius Pilate. We have all these things in the New Testament that point us to specific events on a timeline. And so it's important that we understand what was happening.
The New Testament documents themselves, specifically the Gospels, are claiming to be historical accounts of something that actually happened. So you think of Luke's introduction to his book. He's writing to a gentleman named Theophilus who probably funded his project. And he says there, now I've done my research. I've done the work here. I talked to the people who were involved. I interviewed them. He's saying, I'm laying out for you a reliable account of actually what happened with Jesus Christ. And so the authors themselves are trying to prove to us that this is a real event that happened. It's not something we're just making up. It's not just a philosophy, but it's an actual historical event.
Why would you say that's important for Christians today as kind of maybe either an apologetic tool or just a tool for congregations or a fact for congregations?
Because it's rooting of faith in an objective reality. And that's very helpful because I think we live in a time and space where people are obsessed with feelings and the things that are going on inside your heart. And the most important thing is that you experience and feel God. There was even a survey done in Germany among younger Christians. And they were asked what is most important for their Christian life. On place 6 is the Bible. And number 1 is worship music and experiencing God. It's all subjectivity and feeling. And there will be a place and a time where this will fall down and you won't experience God. And then it's important to have your faith located in something that happens outside of you, that it's datable in time and space, and that's what the story of Christ is all about. And it gives me a firm foundation, even though my heart isn't the firm foundation. That's why I love that the Christian faith is a historical faith.
I heard a distinction once about mythology, theology, and philosophy, these 3 ways of thinking about things. And philosophy being really about ideas, and mythology being about stories that tell us about how people were thinking about things, but then Christian theology in particular talking about things that are rooted in space and time. And we want to make sure that we're not teaching a philosophy or a mythology. We're teaching a Christian theology rooted in space and time. And that's not just important because we say it is, that's what the New Testament says.
The best story of the world became history and walked among us. I think it's beautiful like every story, but it's true as history. And that's what I love about the Christian faith.
And it plays a lot into the way we think about preaching. So as a pastor, if I realize that what I'm preaching every Sunday, so St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about how what we delivered to you is what we first received. And he talks about the, I'm going to lose my train of thought here. This is the part we edit out, right? Yeah, okay, thank you. Or we start over. Yeah, let me start over, okay. This also impacts the way we think about our preaching, because if we're preaching a philosophy, if we're preaching a morality, every time I preach on Sunday morning, I'm trying to get my people to do something. I'm trying to make them act or become something they may not be already. If I'm teaching, rather, an event that took place in history, if I'm proclaiming from a historical event, I can tell them something that's happened for them. And it ceases to be a demand, and now it becomes a gift because it's rooted in something that God has accomplished on their behalf, not on something they have to accomplish on God's behalf. So it impacts the way we think about preaching significantly.
Yeah, in many ways, that is the Christian confession. We're just simply saying what God did for us and for the whole world in time and space through his Son. That's the heart and soul of Christianity. So Christianity is deeply connected to events around 30 to 33 AD. And then there's a 2,000-year history that passes where traditions and the formulation of creeds and doctrines are asserted in certain ways to meet certain challenges in the context. And so for a Christian, it's not just that the faith is rooted in history. There's a long history to the Christian faith. And for example, in Lutheran circles, what we don't confess, though it kind of seems like we do sometimes, is that there was Paul, maybe St. Augustine. I mean, we like part of
sometimes, sometimes,
but yeah.
And then fast forward 1,000 years later, then there's Luther. Well, there's a lot of other figures in between there, some known to us, some unknown to us. And what it does is, like many of the sermons in the book of Acts, Peter in particular, early on in Acts, said that what I've just preached to you is, the patriarchs and prophets said the same exact thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're going 30 to 33, and obviously Christ is the center of everything. But we've got history that goes back even further, right?
Yeah.
We talk about the Jewish people, and all of that is taking place in space and time.
Even the people like Mary, when she's singing the Magnificat, she's rooting her hope in the God who is faithful to his promises to a specific guy, Abraham. If Abraham's not real, Mary's faith is misplaced, right? I mean, this is significant all the way back to Genesis.
The first church historian after Luke, Eusebius, in his, I don't know how many book length church history it is, it may be 8 or 10, but his first chapter, first book on the history of the Christian church starts in the Garden of Eden.
Oh, really?
And somewhere in there, he says something to the effect that all those patriarchs and prophets of the past were in fact, maybe not in name, but in fact Christians, because they're looking forward to the Christ. Yeah. And now Christians after 30 or 33 AD are looking back and confessing the Christ that came. So it's not just 2,000 years.
Yeah, it's however many years.
Thousands of years of people believing in a Messiah, that God would send a Messiah that would crush the work of Satan in the Garden of Eden.
Because it's not just only the resurrection of Christ that's an historical event. All throughout the Bible, salvation is linked to history. Because around about 30 or 40 times in the Old Testament, the phrase occurs, I am the Lord your God who led you out of Egypt.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Egypt for us, it's always more or less a spiritual category. It stands for spiritual bondage, and God freed us from that. But it's first and foremost a specific time and place in history where God has brought his salvation to his people. And that's why when we turn to the resurrection of Christ as the center of history, it also has its foreshadows in the Old Testament.
Yeah. I think what we're doing is describing a confessional faith right now. And that is that as Christians, we confess Christ came, died, rose again for our salvation. Is there anything else? Could we unpack that word a little bit? Because I think confessionalism, or even the word confess, sometimes for American Christians seems a little bit dated, or is just something that they're not used to. So could we unpack
when we
that word
hear
a
the
little
word
bit?
I confess, if you're not rooted in a church that uses that, that's the language of guilty people, right? That's the language of the courtroom. And so when we say I confess, we're saying I believe this is true. I believe that this happened. And it doesn't need to be an extensive, I mean, there are confessions that are volumes, but we're just saying, I believe this happened. I believe that Jesus did this, that this is the case. And so it's something that you almost can't not confess, right? You're confessing something. It's just, what is it that you're actually confessing? And we confess Christ.
The important thing is not the subject of the confession, but the object.
Yeah.
No, that's good.
It's not that my confession is strong or that my feeling is strong in that moment, my faith is strong, but the one whom I'm believing in is strong, and that's Christ, and the story the creeds are telling.
What's the phrase, Christ alone is our confession? What does that come from? Is that Heidelberg Disputation?
I'm not sure.
Is this a historical document?
Are you testing?
You should be the expert.
Oh, the cross alone is our
cross alone is our theology.
The cross alone is
That was a big sign this year.
Yeah, the cross alone is our
Said
theology.
that, Dan. That's very good.
2019, Van Voorhis. Christ alone is our confession. No, I think that's we all confess. It's just a question of what do we confess.
Is there a danger with the language of confessionalism in history? And I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question properly. But where the confession begins to shape the way we do the history, whereas in Christianity, the history...
I'll answer that very quickly.
The history should be shaping the confession, correct? Is that the right way of saying it?
Yeah. You go ahead.
Okay, certain groups can fetishize certain non-biblical documents. And I think that becomes problematic sometimes. And then when we fetishize that confession, we kind of think of that time as the golden age.
Yeah.
Whether it's the 16th century or the 4th century or what have you. And I think we need to kind of remember that, no, the Bible is what we follow. And these confessions, there are confessions from the Roman Rite, right, with the early Apostles' Creed from the 2nd century, all the way up to the present day. People are writing confessions. Some are better than others. But they're all only good insofar as they're telling us what the Bible's saying.
Interesting.
That's why it's so important to do church history, because it's the best cure for romanticizing the past. And especially as pastor, I'm always tempted to romanticize the past. You know, the good old days.
Do you know how many lousy people there were in the church?
Yes, especially even in the 17th century, the golden age of Lutheran Orthodoxy. They had problems all over the place there. And it's good to do church history in these areas.
It's kind of like, people are really into their ancestry. You've got Ancestry DNA and all these websites with this is our family tree. And our family tree doesn't need to be perfect. We can say, oh, we had that one uncle, or back then was that guy. I mean, we can admit it, right? And that's kind of what we do when we do church history. We're like, that guy. Oh, McPherson. Amy Semple McPherson. She's a character.
A charlatan?
One of a kind.
One of a kind. That's what we say.
Yeah.
But I think that's when we think of it as our family tree, this is our heritage. This is who we are. This is how we got to where we are. So I absolutely, with church history, in the writing of confessions and the actions of the church and its people, we have some really, really helpful things to ground us and help us to not fantasize.
Yeah, years ago, you once compared this sort of romantic, nostalgic view of the past to being parallel to a Civil War reenacting.
Yes.
That always stuck with me, because it's very easy in a confessional, traditional faith to assume there's a golden age or an age where they got it just right. If we could just go back there.
And the part with the Civil War, my point was you've got people who are so into that. I mean, they know every last little thing, and as if that's the point. Yeah. As if how many troops there were at Antietam is more important than, hey, what was going on here? And it's another example of a secular fetishizing of the past.
It's violating the First Commandment. So in the end,
Yeah. I'm curious, because we have two historians here and two pastors. For the pastors, have you been in a more confessional type ministry? Have you seen history? Do you have any stories of history changing people and changing their faith? Have you seen that happen in your congregations at all?
No. Just kidding. One of the things I find when we do the study of history in terms of apologetics, one of the things, you teach apologetics in the congregation so your people are more confident to share their faith. But one of the things that always comes out of those conversations is people saying, wow, I never thought about it this way. And I always fear what they mean is, I never actually believed it was really true. I never thought that I could actually stand on something. I've just kind of been hoping that we're right. And what ends up happening is the history, they become far more bold and more interested, and they begin to read the Bible a little more clearly because they've been intimidated by thinking they have to have some magic understanding of this, when in reality, it's just recording what Jesus did, and now I have a better understanding of it, and I have a reason to think it's true. So I hope that gets at your question, but I think the apologetic task of teaching people the historical reliability of the text strengthens people in their faith, and it reaffirms something for them and gives them a ground to stand on.
Yeah.
And it's also good protection from pastors.
That's right.
If your congregation is firmly rooted into the creeds and into the Bible,
that's good.
That's sustainable, because every congregation will have good and bad pastors, and maybe you're one of the bad ones. I mean, you don't want to be, but
are you? But have you been talking to them?
but it's helpful because people will cling to something that's separated from you, and even if you have maybe people might become disappointed in you, but they won't be. They will still cling to the creeds and to the historic faith, and that's valuable.
Yep.
And looking at history reminds us just how tiny we are.
Yes.
There have been when we think we've got it right, remember, we're speaking a language that's foreign to most of the church. We're living in a time that would be foreign to most of the church. And so there's a humbling element there, right? Where it's like, you think you got it so right. And this, well, you've got a witness of saints who might say otherwise or have disagreed on something. And when you can point, I think for me as a Christian, when I can point for myself or to all these people disagreeing or having different opinions or working through difficult ideas, it gives me some relief because, oh, it's not just me who had a hard time with this. It's not just my church that had a hard time with how should the worship service look. This is perennial, and we're all part of this big, messy story until the end of the story and the eschaton. Yeah.
Studying history, church history, the first few centuries is really sobering. You think about for 300 years, off and on, the church was terribly persecuted. I mean, they would take Christians and sew them up in animal skins and turn them loose to wild animals. Or Nero in the first persecution, Christians dipped in pitch, impaled on a stick and lit on fire just to provide light for a garden. So in our day and age, we talk a lot about persecution. We've not seen persecution.
Right, especially in the West, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you go to the first 300 years, it helps you whine less.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's kind of, Malte said earlier, it turns you outside of yourself to an objective means, which is Christ first and foremost, but then it also binds you to this community that is so much larger and humbles you, and I think teaches you that you are a very small part of a greater whole, which is pretty amazing.
There was go ahead.
Chesterton once said that basically tradition is democracy throughout the centuries. So everyone can vote, even the people who are dead now.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's good because our congregation is not just the 30, 40, 50 people that show up on Sunday, but in my case, it includes the people who are sitting there for centuries. And it humbles because you're not allowed to change the faith just because you think you're smarter than the people.
You're smarter than Augustine.
Right. Yeah. But this is something that gives someone like Athanasius or Luther a great deal of credit. What the question to Luther was always, are you alone correct? And I think Athanasius probably felt like he was on an island the majority of the time. He may have been kicked off onto an island at some point. I don't know. But these guys were sort of feeling like they stood alone when in fact the entire church all the way back to Abraham is standing behind them for the faith that they have. So there's really something to that.
Luther wasn't inventing a new church.
That's right. I was, I cannot find this article, and I looked for this article, but years ago when I was in seminary, someone wrote an article about a congregation that had sort of made this move that we're abandoning all creeds and confessions. We have no creed but the Bible and all of this, and then they started their own small groups. And in those small groups, the pastors were finding the people were running into all kinds of troubles because one group had basically become Nestorians. Another group had become Arians. All the old church heresies had popped up in the small groups, and they were like, what do we do about this? Has anyone ever seen anything like this before? And you're like, well, actually, yes. For a very long time, we've been dealing with that. So these become a safeguard from all the winds of doctrine that are blowing around. That Satan's not creative; he's always bringing up the old stuff. And the history, knowing this stuff, is very protective in that.
There's only so many ways you can screw something up.
That's right. Yeah.
And by looking at the past, we can see that. You mentioned the Luther, the claim against Luther. Are you alone wise? Or some of the controversialists in the Reformation age would say, well, where was your church before Luther? And that's damning. If you don't know how to answer it.
That's right.
And it's got to be, well, it was always there. Lutheranism isn't that's the definition of a cult, right? When something just, all of a sudden you got it right. No, it's just you've got this tradition, you're holding on to it, you're speaking it into your particular age, and you're staying faithful to the message of Christ.
Yeah, our confession is, if you will, small c Catholic. Yeah. We confess alongside all the faithful, Christ-believing Christians for all times and all places.
And I think that's helpful too, because, when I think of some of the people, in some churches today, the church fathers wouldn't be allowed to teach Sunday school, right? I mean, it can be.
Some of them are a little wild.
Absolutely.
It depends on people.
Absolutely. And we can say that, right? It's like the family tree with the crazy uncle, right? All right, but we love them anyways.
Yeah.
I mean,
Origin on the felt board.
I don't know if I'd want Origin teaching Sunday school.
Crazy uncle, I tell you.
But it reminds us, there are so many people who are part of this Catholic, meaning universal church, that as soon as we start saying, well, our little corner got it, we're pure as anything, be careful.
Yep.
Be careful, because it's humbling to do history, I think, for the church. And that's good.
Yeah. Guys, this has been great. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Welcome.